I've always preferred hiking alone. It's not that I don't like people. I just like the quiet. There's something peaceful about moving through the woods with nothing but your own thoughts, away from the noise of the world. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, some short, some multi-day trips deep in the backcountry. I plan them carefully, pack light but smart, and always stick to my route. This one was supposed to be no different. I had picked a remote section of forest, an old trail that wasn't well traveled. It wasn't an official route anymore, just something that had been used years ago but had since fallen off the maps. I found it through an old hiking forum where people shared forgotten trails, places where you wouldn't run into anyone for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I left my truck at the base of the trail just after sunrise. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was clear. Perfect hiking weather. My pack was snug on my shoulders, my boots were broken in, and I had my GPS, my compass, and a paper map just in case. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but visible, winding through thick trees and following the curve of a ridge. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and check my bearings. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the path became, but I expected that. I had planned for it. What I hadn't planned for was what happened next. I was about 4 hours in when I noticed something strange. The trail I had been following just stopped. Not in the usual way where it fades into overgrowth and you have to pick your way through. This was different. One moment there was a clear path. The next, nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had walked here in years. I frowned, checking my GPS. Still showed I was on the right path. I pulled out my compass and double-checked my position. According to everything I had, I was still where I was supposed to be. But looking around, I could see that wasn't true. The forest didn't match my map. The ridge should have been on my right, sloping down toward a small river. But the land here was flat, dense with trees that weren't supposed to be this close together. Felt wrong. I turned back the way I came, thinking maybe I had veered off without realizing it. But after a few steps, I stopped. The trail was gone. Not overgrown. Not hidden. Just gone. My stomach tightened. I knew better than to panic. I had trained for this, read survival books, watched videos on how to handle being lost in the woods. Stay calm. Use your tools. Retrace your steps. I took a deep breath and pulled out my map again. If I couldn't find the trail, I could at least navigate back to my truck by following the terrain. I marked my last known location and picked a direction that should take me back to where I started. I walked and walked and walked, but nothing changed. The trees all looked the same, tall and straight, their trunks packed too close together. The ground was covered in thick underbrush that I didn't remember passing through earlier. No landmarks, no clearing, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I checked my GPS again, but now it was frozen. The screen showed my last location, but the tracker wasn't moving. I switched to my compass and adjusted my course, pushing through the thick brush. My breathing was steady, but I could feel my pulse creeping up. Then I saw something that made me stop. A tree stripped of its bark. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Trees get damaged. Whether animals, disease, it happens. But as I stepped closer, I saw the marks. Deep, precise cuts like something or someone had stripped the bark on purpose. The exposed wood underneath was fresh, the edges still raw. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone out here. I kept moving, faster now, forcing my way through the dense brush. I had to get back to the truck. I had to get out. But the further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I found the rope. It was stretched between two trees at chest height, nearly invisible against the bark. My foot caught it just as I saw it, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. I spun around, scanning the trees, my skin crawling. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I was being hunted. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had led me off the trail. Someone had been waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the map, the compass, the route. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My pack bounced against my back. But I didn't stop. My legs burned. My lungs ached. But I pushed forward, crashing through the undergrowth, desperate to get away. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, half hidden behind the trees. Tall, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop to look. I veered left, sprinting downhill, my boots slipping on loose dirt. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurred with sweat. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, fast, close. I broke into a clearing and nearly collapsed with relief. There, just beyond the trees, I could see the road, my truck. I didn't slow down. I sprinted across the gravel, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas, tearing out onto the road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the highway, that I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking, my shirt soaked with sweat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road. But there was nothing, just empty forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how they led me off the trail. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust. The kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, hiking, camping. I know what's out there. I know the animals, the sounds, the way the forest breathes. I never thought I'd be scared of something as simple as a dog. This happened 2 years ago. I still can't explain it, but I know what I saw. I was on a solo hunting trip deep in the forest, about 15 miles from the nearest road. No trails, no campsites, just untouched wilderness. That's how I liked it. Quiet, empty, real. I was after deer, and I knew this area was good for it. I had my rifle, enough food for a few days, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of being alone in the woods. I should have left the second I saw the tracks. I had hiked in during the morning, set up my camp near a small creek, and spent most of the day scouting. As the sun started dipping, I found the first set of prints. They looked like dog tracks, big ones, but there was something off about them. The spacing was wrong, too far apart, like whatever left them had an unnatural stride. And the claws dug deep, deeper than any wolf or stray should have. Something about them made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just a big dog, maybe a lost hunting hound. It happens. People lose dogs out here. But as I kept walking, I noticed the prints circled my camp. Not a straight path, a circle. That's when the unease set in. A dog wouldn't just pace around a camp and leave. If it was lost or hungry, it would have come straight in. I followed the tracks a bit longer until I lost them in the underbrush. I shook it off and headed back to camp. I built a fire, ate my food, and sat listening to the woods settle into night. The air was cold, the fire crackling, and the forest alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the trees. Then, just after midnight, the woods went silent. The silence. I woke up suddenly, not because of a noise, but because of the lack of one. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know that silence is never good. It means something big is near. Predator. A bear, maybe. I reached for my rifle, sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, and listened. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Steady. Just outside my tent. I went still, every muscle locking up. It wasn't the heavy huffing of a bear. It wasn't the quick, sniffing breaths of a deer. It was controlled, even, almost deliberate. Then came the sound of paws on the dirt. A slow step, then another, not wandering, pacing, circling my tent. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My brain told me it was just a stray dog. Coyote, maybe, but my gut told me something was wrong. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The steps stopped. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an hour before finally laying back down. I didn't sleep. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The sounds of the woods returned, the usual birds and wind in the trees. But when I stepped outside my tent, my stomach dropped. The tracks were back. Deep, clear, circling my tent over and over and over. And then I saw something worse. Across the clearing, in the trees where the light barely reached, something had dug into the dirt. A long, deep trench like an animal had been lying there. Watching, I felt exposed, like I had been studied all night. I packed up my rifle and decided to hunt closer to camp that day. I didn't want to be out too far if whatever this was came back. The day was quiet, too quiet. I saw no deer, no squirrels, not even a bird. The whole forest felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I headed back to camp, the sun getting low, I caught movement in the trees. I stopped, gripping my rifle. Then I saw it. A dog, big, black, sitting perfectly still between the trees, half in shadow. It wasn't panting. It wasn't moving, just watching. I stared at it, my pulse pounding. It didn't look like a stray. Its body was too thin, its legs too long. Its head was low, its eyes locked onto mine. I took a step back. It stood up, not like a dog standing from a sitting position. It rose, slowly, deliberately. I lifted my rifle. My instincts screamed to aim, but something in me, some deep primal fear, told me not to. I backed away, step by step, never looking away. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, watching. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was almost gone. I built the fire high. My hands were shaking as I ate. The feeling of being watched never left. That night, I didn't go inside my tent. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, waiting. And sure enough, it came back. I saw the eyes first, low to the ground, just beyond the fire's glow. Two dim, yellow eyes, unblinking, watching me. Then movement. The dog stepped forward, just enough for me to see it clearly. Its ribs stuck out beneath matted fur. Its legs were too long, its back slightly arched. It was like a dog stretched too far, like something wearing a dog's skin but not knowing how to fit inside it. Took another step. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. Then it lowered its head to the ground and started crawling toward me. Not walking, not running, crawling, its belly pressed to the dirt, legs moving unnaturally, its eyes never leaving mine. That broke me. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees. The firelight flickered. When I looked back, it was gone. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my pack, doused the fire, and ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about moving quietly. I just moved, fast. Every so often, I'd stop to listen. Every time I heard it, pause on the dirt, following, not running, not attacking, just following. I don't know how long I hiked before I saw my truck through the trees. I sprinted, threw my gear inside, and tore down the road, gravel spraying behind me. Only when I hit the highway did I stop to breathe. I never went back. I don't know what I saw. A sick dog? A wolf with mange? Some rabid stray? I tell myself that. I try to believe it. But deep down, I know the truth. It wasn't a dog. And it wasn't afraid of me. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few hundred miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's going to go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark, the soft hum of the engine, the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead, red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured, not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty. The only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help, and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the road still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, The toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead something moved, a shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped, not when my legs burned, not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose, until I saw my truck in the distance, until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. I've always liked the quiet. Cities drain me. The noise, the crowds, the feeling that I can never be truly alone. That's why, every fall, I rent a cabin somewhere deep in the woods and spend a week away from everything. No phone, no internet, just me and the wilderness. It's something I look forward to all year. This time, I picked a spot deeper in the forest than usual. A place barely marked on the map, only reachable by a long, winding dirt road. The listing online said it was a secluded, off-grid cabin with a generator, a well for water, and a wood-burning stove. Perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the thick tree line. The drive had been rough. The road was little more than a series of ruts through the dirt, and my truck struggled over rocks and dips. By the time I reached the cabin, I was relieved to get out and stretch. The place was small, just a single room with a loft for sleeping. A woodpile was stacked neatly against one wall, and the scent of pine filled the air. No neighbors, no signs of life, just the endless stretch of forest pressing in from all sides. Exactly what I wanted. I spent the first night like I always do, lighting a fire, heating up a can of soup, and reading by lantern light. The generator worked fine, but I preferred the dim glow of the lantern. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and a distant owl called out into the darkness. Peaceful. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early, just as the sun was rising, and stepped outside to take a piss. The air was crisp, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. As I stood there, I noticed something strange. On the dirt path leading up to the cabin, there were footprints. Not mine. I hadn't seen them the night before, and they were fresh. The dirt was still slightly damp from the morning dew, and the prints were deep. Someone had been here. My first thought was that maybe they belonged to a hunter or a hiker who had wandered close. But the prints led directly to my cabin. They stopped at the front porch, then turned around and disappeared into the woods. I didn't like that. I checked the door, still locked. Nothing inside was missing or disturbed. Maybe it had been a ranger checking on the cabin? But why wouldn't they knock? And why come in the middle of the night? I shook it off and spent the day hiking, pushing deeper into the woods, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the whole time I felt uneasy. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside. A soft, deliberate crunching sound. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved slowly, circling the cabin. The walls were thin, and I could hear the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. The weight of someone careful not to be heard. Then silence. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything. But the night stretched on, quiet and still. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin completely. Someone had walked the perimeter, stopping at the windows, standing just beyond the glow of the lantern I had left burning. They had been watching me. I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night, not after that. I loaded my gear into my truck, turned the key, and nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it was gone. Not dead. Removed. Someone had taken it in the night. My stomach twisted. This wasn't some accident. Someone was messing with me. I wasn't trapped, not yet. I had food, water, and a rifle in the cabin. But without my truck, I was at least 20 miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I decided to wait until daylight and walk out in the morning. I barricaded the door as best I could, pushed the table against it, stacked firewood in front of the windows. Then I sat by the stove, rifle in my lap, and waited. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off. A noise snapped me awake, a soft scraping sound just outside the window. I turned, barely breathing. The lantern flickered, casting weak shadows across the room. The window was small, just above the kitchen counter. Something was blocking the light, a shape, a person standing right against the glass. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Whoever was out there didn't move either, just stood there watching. Then, slowly, they reached up and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, then silence. I raised the rifle. My hands were shaking. The figure didn't react. They just stood there for another long moment before stepping away into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I left everything behind. I grabbed my rifle, my backpack, and started walking. The forest was thick, the trees pressing in around me. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig made my pulse jump. Hours passed. I had no signal, no sense of direction except away. Then, just as the sun started sinking again, I stumbled onto a road. Not the one I had come in on, but a road. And standing there, parked in the middle of it, was an old pickup. A man stood beside it, watching me. He was older, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. I stopped, gripping the rifle. "You lost?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. He studied me for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the truck. "Come on, I'll get you out of here." I didn't have a choice. I climbed in. As we drove, I told him everything, the footprints, the noises, the figure at the window. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "You're lucky," he said. "Why?" I asked. He glanced at me. "Because whoever that was, they usually don't let people leave." I didn't ask anything else after that. When we reached the nearest town, I called a tow truck for my vehicle, packed my things, and left. I never went back, and I never will. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Or maybe I was just being stupid. Either way, when my friend Matt told me about his uncle's cabin and how he needed someone to watch over it for a week, I said yes. The idea of being alone in the woods didn't scare me at first. I'd gone camping before, spent nights outdoors, and I figured a week away from work and distractions would be good for me. No emails, no meetings, no people. Just me, a few books, and the sound of nature. But the moment I turned onto that dirt road leading to the cabin, something felt off. The trees pressed in too close. The road was barely wide enough for my car. The sun was starting to set, and the light filtering through the trees cast long shadows that made everything look stretched and distorted. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place getting to me. I kept driving. After a few more miles, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I expected, just a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and a single window on the front. There was no other house for miles. No cell service either. My bars had disappeared almost an hour ago. I parked, got out, and stretched. The air was cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead, just trees. I grabbed my bag and headed up to the porch. The key was right where Matt said it would be, under a loose board near the door. The lock was stiff, the door heavier than it looked, but it creaked open after a few tries. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in a while. The cabin was one large room, bed in the corner, small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a fireplace, a few oil lamps on the shelves, and a single door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. It wasn't cozy, but it was enough. I set my bag down, checked the supplies Matt had left: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight with extra batteries. There was no electricity, just an old propane stove for cooking and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I lit a fire, made some soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind. I tried to let the quiet relax me, but it didn't. Felt wrong, like the forest was watching. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dull red glow. Then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate crunch outside. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Slow, careful, not an animal. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The only weapon I had was a hunting knife Matt had left in one of the kitchen drawers. Another step, closer now. Then it stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I let out a slow breath. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the leaves. I told myself that over and over, but I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came and everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been out there. I told myself I had overreacted. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, checking the nearby stream for fresh water, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the feeling never left. The sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, kept the knife within reach. It didn't help. The knocking started just past midnight. Soft, slow. Knock, knock, knock. Not at the door. At the window, I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The window had no curtains, no way to block out whatever was outside. I didn't move. The knocking came again. I forced myself to look. Nothing, just the darkness pressing against the glass. I sat in bed, gripping the knife, waiting. The knocking never came again, but I didn't sleep. I woke up exhausted, every muscle tense. I stepped outside, scanning the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints.
Bora.
Human, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. I grabbed my keys, threw open the car door. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Not loose. Gone. A sound behind me, a soft rustling in the trees. I turned, scanning the forest. Nothing. But I knew someone was there, watching, waiting. I grabbed the knife and backed toward the cabin. If I couldn't leave, I needed to survive the night. I barricaded the door, stacked furniture against it, kept the knife in my hand. The knocking started at midnight, not just at the window this time. The walls, the door, soft, deliberate taps, like they were playing with me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob turned. Slow. Testing. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Leaving. Circling. Fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. Didn't move. Just waited for morning. First light, I ran. I didn't pack. Didn't look back. Just sprinted down the dirt road, heart hammering. I ran for almost an hour before I saw another car. An older man driving a pickup. He slowed when he saw me, eyes wide. I must have looked insane. He drove me to the nearest town. I called Matt, told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. Yeah, he said after a long pause. My uncle stopped going up there too. I never asked why. I didn't want to know. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, when everything is too quiet, I swear I still hear knocking. The disappearance of James Hunter, I don't know how to start this. I guess I'll just say what happened, exactly as I remember it. My name is Nathan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and I love hiking. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, weekend trips, backcountry trails, solo expeditions. I'm not an expert, but I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. That's why I can't explain what happened last fall. It started with a missing person. The trail that wasn't there, James Hunter, went missing in October. He was an experienced hiker just like me, liked the quiet, the solitude. He wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to take stupid risks. He told his family he was going on a 3-day hike in the national forest about 6 hours from my town. He never came back. They searched for weeks. They never found him. I don't know why I fixated on his case. Maybe because he reminded me of myself. Maybe because I had hiked in that same area before. Or maybe because I felt like I could find him. I don't mean that in a heroic way. I wasn't trying to be some kind of rescuer. But I knew the woods and I knew how people got lost. If he had fallen, if he had gotten disoriented, there had to be clues. So, a month after he disappeared, I packed my gear and drove to the trailhead. It was late November, cold but not freezing. The trees were mostly bare, the ground covered in dry leaves. The official search had ended weeks ago, but I wasn't expecting to find a body. Just something. A sign, anything. I started early in the morning. The first few miles were familiar, well-maintained trails, clear markers. I followed the same route James had taken, retracing his last known steps. Then I reached the part where he supposedly vanished. The problem was I didn't see how. The trail was clear. No sudden drop-offs. No thick underbrush that could have hidden a fall. If he had gone missing here, it had to be because he left the trail. I looked around, searching for anything unusual. That's when I saw the other path. It wasn't marked. It was barely visible, just a faint indentation in the ground, leading off into the trees, almost like an old trail, long abandoned. I checked my map. It wasn't on there. The first mistake, I don't know why I followed it. Maybe I thought James had done the same thing. Maybe I was just curious. Either way, I stepped off the main path and started walking. First, it was fine. The trail, though faint, was still there. It wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing closer together. The air felt heavier, like the forest was pressing in. Then I saw the boot. It was half buried in the dirt, covered in leaves. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed. It looked like it had been there a long time. I nudged it with my foot. It didn't move. It wasn't James's boot. I knew that right away. It was too old, too weathered. But it meant something. Someone else had been here before. I kept walking. The cabin, the trail got harder to follow. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush tangled. I checked my compass, trying to keep track of my direction. South, slightly southwest. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, barely visible through the trees.
No windows.
Just a single door, slightly open. I stopped. There was no reason for a cabin to be here. The national forest wasn't private land. No hunting lodges, no ranger stations. And yet, here it was. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over leaves. The door creaked as the wind pushed it slightly open. Inside, it was dark. I took out my flashlight and shined it inside. Empty.
No furniture. No debris.
Just a wooden floor, covered in dust. Then I noticed the scratches. Deep grooves in the wood, running in random patterns. Like someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. Over and over again. I backed away. The forest felt too quiet. Then I heard something move. Not inside the cabin. Behind me, the feeling of being watched. I turned fast, my heart pounding. Nothing. Just trees. Just silence. But I knew I wasn't alone. I listened, holding my breath. The air was thick, unmoving. The smell of damp wood and dead leaves filled my nose. Then a branch snapped. Closer this time. I didn't wait. I turned and walked back the way I had come. Fast but not running. The trail was harder to follow now. It was like the trees had shifted, the path less visible. I kept my compass in my hand, checking my direction. South, slightly southwest. I kept walking. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The boot, the same one I had seen before. I had walked in a circle. The descent into panic that wasn't possible. I had been walking in a straight line. Hadn't I? I took a slow breath, forcing myself to think. I wasn't lost. I had a compass, a map. I just needed to reorient myself. I turned, adjusting my direction. North. I walked. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The sky was darkening, the air colder. Then I saw the cabin again. The chase I ran. I don't know why I ran, but I did. Branches whipped against my face, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. Then I heard footsteps. Not mine. Something else. Running. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I sprinted, lungs burning, legs shaking. Then a break in the trees. The road. I stumbled onto the dirt, nearly collapsing as I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not looking back. The final clue, I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out, leaning against the car, my hands still trembling. That's when I noticed something stuck to my boot. Piece of paper, old, yellowed, torn. One word was written on it in shaky, uneven letters. Run. I never went back. Camping alone had always been my thing. I wasn't antisocial, I just liked the quiet. The kind of silence you only get when you're deep in the woods, away from everything. No traffic, no distant hum of the city, no people. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. That was real peace. I had done solo trips for years, always looking for more isolated spots. The further, the better. This time, I had picked a place deep in the backwoods, miles from any official campsite. I found it on an old map. No marked trails, no roads leading directly to it, just a patch of forest with a small, unnamed lake in the center. Perfect. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, knife, first aid kit. I didn't like carrying a lot of weight, but I never cut corners on the essentials. I set out early in the morning, driving for hours down a mix of paved roads, dirt paths, and eventually, nothing but overgrown trails barely wide enough for my truck. By noon, I reached the point where I had to continue on foot. I parked in a small clearing, locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just following an old logging road that had long been swallowed by the forest. The trees were thick, mostly pines, their needles soft underfoot. The air was crisp, clean. I moved at a steady pace, adjusting my pack every now and then. The weight sat evenly across my shoulders, nothing digging in. A few hours in, the path faded completely, turning into raw forest. No more signs of human activity. I liked that. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Birds chirped in the distance, but even their calls felt distant. The wind barely reached this deep into the trees, making everything feel still. After another hour, I reached the lake. It was exactly as I had imagined. Small, untouched, surrounded by thick trees. The water was dark, reflecting the sky. No signs of people. No trash, no footprints. I found a spot near the edge, slightly elevated so I wouldn't wake up in a puddle if it rained. I dropped my pack, stretched, and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, staked down tight. I cleared a small fire pit, ringed it with stones, and gathered enough wood to last the night. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to lower. The light filtering through the trees turned gold, casting long shadows across the ground. I built a fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat back, watching the flames. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened, I started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a slight unease. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I tried to brush it off. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge the first night alone. It was probably just my brain adjusting to the quiet. I stoked the fire, let the warmth settle into my skin, and eventually climbed into my tent. I laid there listening. The wind had completely died. Even the insects had gone quiet. I forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke early, stiff from the cold. The fire had burned down to nothing but embers. I stretched, boiled water for coffee, and ate a small breakfast. The lake was perfectly still, like glass. No ripples, no movement. I planned to spend the day exploring. I packed light, just my knife, water, and some snacks, and started walking. The forest around the lake was thick, the trees packed tight. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and patches of thick underbrush. About an hour in, I came across something strange. A small clearing, empty except for an old fire pit. Just a ring of stones, half buried under leaves. Someone had camped here before. I crouched, running my fingers over the stones. They were cold, undisturbed. It had been a long time since anyone used this spot. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I stood, scanning the trees. Nothing. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. I turned back, moving a little faster than I had on the way in. When I reached camp, I felt better. The fire was still smoldering, my gear untouched. I forced myself to relax. The rest of the day passed slowly. I fished for a bit, caught nothing. As the sun dipped lower, the unease returned. The air grew thick, the silence even heavier than the night before. I built the fire higher, letting the flames push back the darkness. I ate quickly, feeling more on edge than I wanted to admit. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, somewhere beyond the firelight. I froze, my pulse hammering. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind. I scanned the darkness, straining my ears. Nothing. I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, but I kept my knife close, just in case. That night, I barely slept. I woke up feeling groggy, my body sore. The fire had burned low again, and the air was colder than before. I stepped outside, stretched, then stopped. My firewood was gone. Not scattered, not chewed up by animals, just gone. A tight knot formed in my stomach. I scanned the ground. No footprints, no signs of movement. I told myself I must have miscounted how much I had left. I didn't believe it. I packed up as fast as I ever had. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt different. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my skin crawl. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but I never did. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A figure, standing still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how long they had been watching me, but I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again.